So we're going to go ahead and get started with the Ottoman Empire, Empire under siege, the crisis of the Ottoman Empire. So we're going to start with there with your notes. We talked about industrialization and how it took place in the United States, industrialization, how it didn't take place in Latin America, how it began in Western Europe and Great Britain, and how that westernization then took place in Japan. We're going to look at responses to westernization in the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire. And so we can remember, like, who are the Ottoman empires again? Just remember that the Ottoman empires were a nomadic Muslim Turks who conquered Byzantium and Constantinople way back when in 1453. So just kind of remembering that about our beautiful Ottomans. These were the same people that were the Gunpowder Empire. So they're part of the Gunpowder Empire that we have here. And they're mostly Sunni Muslim. So there are formerly our Sunni Muslim Empire that takes place. They encompass much of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and we'll see more about them later. And so we also remember the Gunpowder Empire because of the Janissaries. Those were the Christian minority people that held positions in the government. That they had their golden age under Suleiman the Great, and they started to struggle as land trade began to dry up during the Blue Period, during the 1450 to 1750, when Europe begins to really push trade by seas. So remember, the Ottoman Turks were the reason why they had to do trade by seas in the first place, because Europe wanted to make their way to Asia and India, to China and to India. They wanted to make their way to East, South, and Southeast Asia, and they couldn't because the Ottoman Turks wouldn't let them pass without an increased tax. And so they were forced to sail by sea around the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Africa, and then eventually to East, South, and Southeast Asia. And so land trade is going to be like a no-go in the Blue and the Orange period. And so the Ottoman Empire kind of begins to decline. And so this was the Ottoman Empire. We can see that they have some of North Africa here, they have some of Eastern Europe here, and they have some of Asia here. But they take over a lot of parts of the Middle East. But let's see how the Ottoman Empire changes. So whenever we look at a map like this and we're trying to analyze what it shows us, we always want to look at the key first. And so we can see the Ottoman Empire throughout the ages. So from 1800, this is the extent of the Ottoman Empire. So it's showing us this is what it looks like when we're beginning the Orange period from 1750. So this is what it looks like in 1800. As time goes by, much of that land is going to be eaten away, and it's going to be taken away by other empires. We'll talk about those other empires. So by 1877, it's getting smaller, and by the end of the century, by the turn of the century, they also lose this portion of land here. So none of this is any longer a part of the empire, and the Ottoman Empire becomes incredibly tiny. It becomes incredibly small, and it becomes incredibly weak. So it gets really, really small. And they're trying to figure out what do we do, especially because the Russian Empire is encroaching on them to the northeast, and as we have these really powerful European empires building up here. All right, let's go. By the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire shrinks dramatically at the hands of Russia, the British, Austrians, French, all of those people. And it's going to be considered the sick man of Europe, because they're like, you're kind of losing here. You're not able to really take yourself. They lost territory everywhere. We just saw in the map that's there. They lost territory to India, in India, West Africa, Central Asia, Egypt we're going to come back to, Greece, the Balkans. And they're also going to see a military decline. And why their military declines is because they fall behind on Western technology. They don't want access to all those new and rapid fire guns that they have there. So let's go on. This technology and military gap with Europe is growing rapidly during the industrial era. So during the Industrial Revolution, we see the Ottoman Empire is falling further and further behind. And while they once had a really effective military, their military is now, their gunpowder empire, their military is now going to be like really behind. It's like somebody who was really great in math in middle school, and then as they get older, when they get to high school, they're like, well, you were great at algebra, but can you do algebra, geometry, and calculus? And no, I can't. So overland trade diminishes their importance. And there's no real Ottoman industrialization. And so they start going into debt to try to create and manufacture that industrialization, to try to create these goods. And so they get into these unequal treaties to pay off their debt. So just like the ones that were made initially with Japan before they were able to truly revitalize. So their economy was really, really low, and in order to finance their economic development, they took out loans from Britain, from France. And when they couldn't pay those loans back, Great Britain and France came to reap some of their colonies, or some of their territory. One of those territories was Egypt. Great Britain was like, don't worry about paying us the loan. We'll just take Egypt instead. So just kind of remember that one. Capitulation treaties is kind of like, capitulation means that you surrender to an opponent. And they surrendered to their enemies who they used to think that they outranked. They used to be like, Europe is bad. Europe is backward. We're better than they are. And now they have to succumb to like, not so much. It's so sad. And here we see the rise of France and of England. And here's the ghost. Here's death coming for the Ottoman Empire. I think I'm going to have you do another SAQ on this one tomorrow, of like showing death coming out for them. So let's talk about this though. So the Ottoman Empire, they're called the sick man of Europe, not the dead man of Europe, because they're not dead yet. They ain't dead yet. They're not going to be dead until 1914. I mean, that's not funny. That's sad. But they're not going to be dead until then. And so between 1750 and 1914, the Ottoman Empire is going to undergo some reforms, and they're going to try to attempt modernization. And so at the very, very end of this lecture, you should be able to see some of the reforms that they made, how they tried to westernize their military. So that's one. Some attempts they made to create an enlightened government that they were able to do. So in order to get there, we have to start here with their military reform. So in the 1800s, the Janissaries, they are kind of ticked off. There's an attempt at military of Western style reforms, just like Japan did. There's the attempts that they're going to try to make to the military corps of Janissaries. But the Western reforms are kind of sabotaged by the Janissaries and the Ulama. The Ulama are religious scholars. And they see these Western reforms as being they're in conflict with Islam, in conflict with their own institutions that had been in existence for decades. And they saw this Western reform as an infidel, an outsider, an unbelievers kind of reforms. And they opposed them. Other reforms that they were trying to make were the Tanzimat reforms, and those began in 1839 to 1876. We're going to go into those in a little bit more detail after I figure out why I did these really slow transitions. Tanzimat is going to be a self-strengthening movement where they try to use military training, enlightenment constitutions, and new laws in order to change things within the Ottoman Empire. So let's take a look at how the Tanzimat reforms failed. They led to dissent from those religious conservatives, and they led to attacks on the Sultan, like I said, by those Janissaries and by those ulama. who felt that it was against them. It led a lot of questions as to like, who are the Ottoman Empire? Are we European, or are we Middle Eastern? Are we Muslim first, or are we part of this European continent? Where are we? Where do we go? So it sparks all this opposition by religious conservatives. Remember the ulama, and they rebel against, especially these Islamic conservatives. They don't want legal equality under the Tanzimat reforms. They're like, who are we to have this legal equality that's there? There's also a little bit of rebelling or resistance on the part of high-level bureaucrats because they're displaced from power. They're like, we've been running this thing for decades, and now you want to change things? And they're determined to force checks on the Sultan, and they even want to kind of get rid of him. And that's when this group of people come in, the Young Turks. I love these people. They're complete and utter badasses. Oh my gosh, I said a bad word. But they are. So let's take a look at who they are. Here are the Young Turks. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to talk about them. So, the Young Turks from 1889 to 1914, they're completely all about, they're like, let's go ahead and we need to reform our country. Like, we need to reform our empire. We need to get with it. We need to modernize. So the Young Turks are like, modernization, yes. We're doing this. They demand political and social change, and they overthrow the Sultan. And what Sultan do they overthrow? They overthrow this guy, Sultan Abdul Hamid, who's an absolutist. And if he reminds you of kind of like those absolute monarchs from Europe, right? He suspends the constitution that they were reforming. He dissolves the parliament that was just created. He exiled liberals. Liberals are people who want to make these changes. And he executed opposition members. How did the Young Turks respond? They were like, oh, heck. No, we're getting rid of this guy. And they did. They were like, we're educated in Europe. We're enlightened. We are changing things. And like the Young Turks, the reason why they're called that is not because like they were young people and not because they were all Turks. Many of them weren't even Muslim. It was because they were like, we're bringing about a new day in the Ottoman Empire. We want a new, spry, springy, young Ottoman Empire. And the Turks just as a throwback to who they were. So they demand the overthrow of this Sultan. They demand an enlightened government. They want free religion, free education. They want women's rights. Holla, yes. And in 1909, they do take over. The Young Turks eventually take over in 1909. Remember, this is at the end of our period. They install a puppet head figure sultan. They're like, you're just going to be the sultan. You're just going to wear the little hat. This is the sultan's hat. And you're going to shut your mouth, right? And then they provide universal suffrage. Suffrage means vote. Everybody gets a right to vote. So in this military coup that they take over, a coup is when they take over a government. In this military coup, they take over, and they take over not so that they can get rights just to themselves. They take over so they can get rights for everybody else. Freedom of religion, freedom of education, emancipation of women. What? These sound like Enlightenment ideas, people. What? Holla. Yes. The army continued to decline, and the empire continues to shrink. But they're like, we want to pass forth these reforms. And they even try to appease some people because they become so radical in that they make Turkish the official language of the empire, but it's a little too late. So what happens to the Ottomans? They survive. They survive to the end of the period. They survive until 1914. Something big is going to happen in 1914. And that's only because the Europeans did not know how to get rid of them without ruining the balance of power. And what does that mean? Europe's, they didn't know how to ruin, who was going to get the territory? So it was like, if they get rid of the Ottomans, who takes over their territory? Will it be Britain that takes over the territory? Will it be France? that takes over the territory, if either of these takes over the territory, that makes them the new big man on campus. That makes them the new threat. So instead, they decided to keep the Ottoman Empire around so that no one power in Europe can have too much power. So like Kanye said, no one man should have all that power. And that's what they did. They kept Ottoman Empire around. They were like, okay, we'll just take you off piece by piece, but you still get to be around because we don't want one country in Europe developing into an empire that's then going to try to take over the other countries. Oh, the Ottoman Empire. Those were the days. Look at them. He doesn't even know that his end of time is coming. The Eastern question is going to put forth. So this is going to lead up to what is the Eastern question. By the 1800s, industrialization, nationalism, imperialism is happening in Western Europe. It's all leading to competition. There's a balance of power because no one country has more power than another. It's balanced. Everybody's powerful. Everybody's just as pretty as everyone else. In 1900, Europe is going to freak out because of the balance of power. And they're going to point to the Ottomans as being the Eastern question. The Europeans are worried that the Ottoman Empire would collapse, creating a vacuum for somebody, nobody knows, for somebody to take over, for somebody to try to usurp power, for somebody to try to develop an empire. And so the Eastern question becomes with what is going to happen next? Will it explode? What's going to happen? Will it all explode? Okay. Let's go into labor and migrations during this period. So this is a big one. This is a bigums. You're probably going to have another SAQ on this one too. Labor migrations in the age of imperialism and industrializations. Europeans began to migrate to the U.S. And to other colonies like crazy. We have 50 million Europeans migrated between 1800 and 1914 to the U.S. This is when we have especially a lot of North and Western Europeans are coming in. Other settlers such as Canada, Argentina, and Australia, and New Zealand, and South Africa are also getting people coming in from Europe. They're all getting there too. That's why we see white South Africans. That's why we see lots of white people in Canada. Canada, there are Native Americans there. That's why Argentina, you can find a lot of people that speak German in Argentina. That's why Australia, the Hemsworth brothers, Liam and whoever the other guy that was married to Miley Cyrus, they're not native there. They came during this period in time when they took over. Most Europeans migrate because they became cultivators, herders, or skilled laborers. And indentured labor migration was more typical in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific Islands. We have 2.5 indentured laborers. That means an indentured laborer means that you agree to work for a number of years to pay off your travel to a place. So it's just a certain amount of time. And they tended to work in tropical and subtropical plantations. Japanese laborers moved to Hawaii. That's why we see a large number of Asians in Hawaii to work on Hawaiian sugar plantations. Indian laborers went to Fiji, Guyana, and Trinidad. That's why if you go to places, especially throughout the Caribbean, you see a large Indian population there as well. All right, take a moment. Think about, take a moment to quiz yourself on these. See which ones you know on your own, which ones you're able to figure out. And I will see you when you return tomorrow. Bye. That was weird. Just ignore. Sorry. Okay, start up.